Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 280. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about the new anti-terrorism bill, Mark Milley's commencement speech at West Point, and then I have a lot of news on the war in Ukraine and the U.S.-Russian relationship. So, Shared Today's show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You can also find it on the blog at antiwar.com. The video version of the show goes up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You could subscribe to the show anywhere you listen to podcasts, also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And you could donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Crypto, and all that information is in the show notes page. You can follow myself at KyleAnzalone_ on Twitter. And another great way to help out the show is by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Great selection of high quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. My personal favorite is the sports cream, and it works absolutely great if you want to pair the sports cream with some gummies. The gummies help very well with anxiety. You feel a little bit nervous, got something big coming up, just want to be able to maybe go to sleep a little bit better. The gummies work fantastic with that. So get yourself some sports cream, get yourself some of the great gummies they have at Paloma Verde, and then you can use the promo code PEACE when you check out. That will get you a discount, and it will get the show kit bad. So it's a great way to help out yourself and help out your favorite podcast. If you're already familiar with CBD, you know what you like. They have everything, all the CBD products at Paloma Verde that you can imagine. They also have the lab test results on their website for their product, so you know you're getting exactly what they advertise. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the show. And the first article I have today, I wrote with Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and it is titled, House Passes Bill Expanding Federal Anti-Terrorism Mandate. This is from May 20th. U.S. lawmakers have passed sweeping domestic terrorism bill that will create several new law enforcement units and establish a task force to seek out white supremacists and neo-Nazis within the armed services and federal police agencies. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022 narrowly passed in a 222 to 203 vote on Wednesday, largely along party lines, with Illinois' Representative Adam Kinzinger the only Republican to vote yes on the measure. In addition to creating a new anti-terrorism office under the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, the legislation also instructs the FBI to assign more prosecutors to target hate crimes and domestic terrorism. A separate interagency task force will analyze and combat white supremacist and neo-Nazi infiltration of the uniformed services and federal law enforcement agencies, and will be required to submit reports to senior officials and lawmakers every 6 months. The bill's sponsor, Democrat Representative Brad Schneider, said the legislation was needed following a racially motivated mass shooting in Buffalo last weekend that left 10 dead, arguing violent extremism is a serious threat to Americans across the country. Schneider, who also introduced similar legislation several times since 2020, nonetheless acknowledged, "I can't say this law would have stopped what happened in Buffalo." Republican opposition to the bill was largely centered on fears that parents opposed to public schools' COVID-19 mandates would be labeled as domestic terrorists, some pointing to Department of Justice memos issued last year, which called on federal police to investigate a spike of harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence at school board meetings. The order followed a string of heated confrontations between parents and school officials over COVID restrictions, and recently prompted Texas state government to sue Joe Biden administration for silencing parents and labeling them as terrorists. GOP opponents We're joined by some progressive Democrats in the lead up to the vote, led by Missouri Representative Cori Bush, who said that the legislation could result in increased federal surveillance of minorities and activists, and cited concerns raised by the ACLU and other civil rights organizations. Amendments to the bill ultimately satisfied the skeptics, however, with no Democrats voting against the measure on Wednesday. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that the upper chamber would take up the bill this week, although it's not clear if he can overcome Republican objections to the legislation. So this bill, I think, is something to be concerned about, assuming it passes the Senate and gets put in place. Now, looking into potential, white supremacists among federal police forces and the armed services, I don't have as much opposition to. There probably is some issue with that. There was an investigation done by the AP into the Florida penitentiary system that found some pretty widespread, rampant white supremacist ideology among prison guards. That kind of stuff is a real issue and is going to lead to abuse of prisoners and miscarriages of justice. Of course, if you look at like the LAPD going back not that long, they were heavily infiltrated by these types of people. And so, there may be need for this in the armed services. However, having a general mandate to go after that, targeting the American people at large, as the congressman acknowledged, it's not going to stop these kind of shootings. He just said, probably wanted to prevent this anyways. But the other issue is that you're going to create all these prosecutors who now have a job of finding domestic terrorists, and they're not very good at stopping actual terrorists, but they're pretty good at entrapping people and creating these false terrorism plots. And so I think you could very easily end up here with something like you had during the Bush administration after 9/11. Trevor Aronson explains in his book, The Terror Factory, how the government manufactures these kinds of cases and crimes where really none exist. Now on to General Mark Milley's commencement speech at West Point. This for antiwar.com on May 22nd. General Milley predicts grim future of deadly great power wars fought in cities. The Joint Chiefs Chairman told graduating West Point students that the next generation of warfare would be technology-based. America's highest-ranking military officer painted a picture of a dark future with great power wars fought in urban environments. Speaking to graduating cadets at the United States Military Academy, General Mark Milley forewarned of death tolls for U.S. soldiers in the tens of thousands. Milley identified Russia and China as the growing powers America will face in the next generation. We are facing right now two global powers, China and Russia, he said. As we are entering a world that is becoming more unstable, the world you are being commissioned into has the potential for significant international conflict between great powers, and that potential is increasing, not decreasing. During the commencement speech, he noted the importance of America confronting Russia and Ukraine. Yet again in Ukraine, we are learning the lessons of aggression left unanswered only embolden the aggressor. After recalling the massive American military casualties in World War I and World War II, the general explained future great power conflicts would likely cause tens of thousands of deaths for U.S. soldiers. 26,000 troops and Marines were killed in only 6 weeks from October to November in 1918. 26,000 troops were killed in 8 weeks during the summer. I think he meant 1942, but the translation I found said 1940. In the summer of 1944, 58,000 Americans were killed in action in the air, sea, and land in 5 theaters of war, and in only 8 weeks. That's the human cost of great power. And of course, he says this in the speech where he's warning we're going to face more great power conflicts. Milley laid out how he believed warfare would evolve over the next quarter century. The general said the new technologies will shape the battlefield, including robotic tanks, ships, and airplanes. He referred to artificial intelligence as the mother of all technologies and said that machines are actually developing the capacity to learn and reason, these abilities covering developments in time and space, resulting in that profound change. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs assesses future conflicts will be fought in cities. The battlefield will be highly complex and almost certainly decisive in urban areas, he said. If Milley is correct, the coming wars will exact a high toll on civilian populations. All right, now let's get into the Ukraine-specific news. The first story I have here is from myself and Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute on May 20th. Russia set conditions to ease Black Sea blockade. Russia has offered to relax its blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports, but only in exchange for sanctions relief from the West amid fears the war raging in Eastern Europe could drive an international food crisis. The Russian Foreign Ministry made the proposal on Thursday after the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Moscow was to blame for global food shortages, insisting it must permit the safe and secure export of grain stored in Ukrainian ports. This from Guterres. There is no effective solution to the food crisis without reintegrating Ukraine's food production, as well as the food and fertilizer produced by Russia and Belarus, into world markets, despite the war. Both Russia and Ukraine are major grain suppliers, with Turkey, Iran, Bangladesh, and Egypt buying the majority of the wheat from the two countries. Poorer nations in the Middle East and North Africa also heavily depend on such imports, including Yemen, Libya, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Renukko later responded, arguing that his country's not solely responsible for the food emergency, while pointing to Western sanctions for blocking the export of grain and fertilizers. This is from the Russian official. You have not only appealed to the Russian Federation, but also deeply at the whole complex of reasons that called the food crisis, he said, slamming the U.S. and European sanctions, which interfere with normal free trade and encompassing food production, including wheat, fertilizers, and others. The UN chief also urged an end to sanctions targeting Moscow's agriculture sector, saying Russian food and fertilizers must have unrestricted access to world markets without indirect impediments. Moscow called for sanctions relief has yet to be received a public response from Washington or Belarus, and I checked today that is, as far as I could tell, still the case. And then we go on to talk about this next article that I wrote, this one for antiwar.com on May 20th. U.S. drawing up plans to sink the Russian Black Sea fleet, and this was according to a Ukrainian official. And so I write here, shortly after Reuters published an exclusive story that the White House was looking to move advanced anti-ship missiles to Ukraine, an official in Kiev said the U.S. is making a plan to sink Russia's Black Sea fleet. Ukrainian Ministry of International Affairs advisor Anton, and I'm not going to try to say this guy's last name, tweeted, the U.S. is preparing a plan to destroy the Russian Black Sea fleet. The effective work of the Ukrainians on Russian warships convinced the U.S. to prepare a plan to unblock the Ukrainian ports. Deliveries of a powerful anti-ship weapon are being discussed. Now, this tweet has since been deleted. It was up, I would say, for about 24 hours. Now, there are plenty of screenshots of it around, and you can also find it on archive.is if anybody is looking to actually see the tweet now that it has been deleted. The official cited the Reuters report on Washington's effort to ship Harpoon and naval strike missiles to Ukraine. The missiles have a range of up to 300 kilometers and cost $1.5 million each. 3 U.S. officials and 2 congressional sources told the outlet the White House was still working out the details for sending the advanced weapons to Ukraine. Logistical issues and the possibility the U.S. would have to remove a launcher from one of its ships to send to Ukraine are current obstacles to completing the transfer. Responding to a question from Newsweek, the State Department did not deny it was working on a plan to take out the Russian fleet. As the conflict is changing, so too is our military assistance to deliver the capabilities Ukraine needs for today's fight as Russian forces engage in a new word offensive in eastern Ukraine. However, the Department of Defense issued a sharp denial of the claims made by Ukrainian officials. The Ukrainian official. I can tell you definitively that's not true, Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby told reporters Thursday afternoon. Although I read an article by Kelly Vlahos on this at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Kelly is absolutely fantastic, and she pointed out that this definitive sounding statement may not actually be as definitive as it sounds, and so I will definitely keep my eye on this going forward. The Pentagon denial applied only to the Ukrainian officials' assertion that the U.S. was helping to sink the Black Sea Fleet, and did not refer to the proposed anti-ship weapons transfer. The Ukrainian official said the attack would help open up Ukraine's ports. Russia currently controls the Black Sea and maintains a blockade. The U.S. has called for an easing of restrictions in the sea to allow food exports from Ukraine to help alleviate global food shortages. Moscow has offered a diplomatic solution to the Black Sea standoff, and I discussed that in that previous article. So, now moving on, it seems that the plan to send the Harpoon missiles to Ukraine is in full force. This from Dave DeCamp on May 23rd at antiwar.com. Lloyd Austin says Ukraine to get Harpoon anti-ship missiles from Denmark. On Monday, Secretary of State Lloyd Austin hosted a meeting of over 40 nations to discuss military aid for Ukraine, and announced afterwards that Denmark would be providing Kiev with Harpoon anti-ship missiles. This from General Mark Milley. I am especially grateful to Denmark, this is Austin said this at a press conference with Mark Milley. I'm especially grateful to Denmark, which announced today that it will provide a Harpoon launcher to Ukraine and missiles to help help Ukraine defend its coast. Sorry, I stumbled on that one a little bit. And so this is pretty significant. Again, these missiles have quite a large range, and the fact that we are able to figure out a way to send them to Ukraine without taking a launcher off our own ship is probably somewhat significant as well. Now, this is a part of a policy that I think is probably being pushed most heavily by the UK Foreign Minister Liz Truss, and myself and Will Porter write on this at May 21st at the Libertarian Institute. UK and allies plan to arm Ukraine, Moldova with NATO standard weapons. Ukraine Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said that London and a number of allies are developing a scheme to supply NATO-grade weapons to Moldova and Ukraine, as Kiev urges for increasingly advanced arms from Western partners despite billions in lethal aid already being provided. Truss told The Telegraph on Friday that she'd like to see Moldova equipped to the NATO standard, noting, "This is a discussion that we are having with our allies," amid continued fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The senior diplomat argued that such transfers were needed to avert another Russian attack in Eastern Europe, claiming President Vladimir Putin has absolutely clear about his ambitions to create a greater Russia and could attempt a land grab around the region. Now, it's not clear to me that that would be the case. There was a Russian military official who wasn't particularly high ranking who did say that that would be something that Russia would try to do. So we'll have to see how this war unfolds. Does Russia have the military capability to even do that? It is a question worth asking at this point. Moldova is situated along Ukraine's southwest border and contains the largely Russian-speaking region of Transnistria, which has been controlled by separatist forces since the 1990s after a brief war with the government. And there's about, I think, 1,500 or so Russian forces in that region of Moldova. Truss went on to say that the UK also wants Kiev to receive more advanced NATO weapons, stating that officials are working to create a joint commission with Ukraine and Poland on upgrading Ukrainian defenses to the NATO standard, so we will scope out and see what that looks like, what the Ukrainians need. While NATO countries have supplied Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars in arms and other military hardware since Russia's invasion began in late February, including shoulder-fired Javelin armor missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, howitzer drones, armored vehicles, anti-air batteries, light arms, and ammunitions. Western nations have been more reluctant to send heavier weapons such as modern tanks and fighter jets. To date, many of the arms received from NATO members are Soviet-era platforms familiar to the Ukrainian military. These are former, states that were a part either of the USSR or the Warsaw Pact, but as NATO expanded, became part of NATO, and so now they're sending these weapons to Ukraine. However, the latest American military aid package worth $40 billion includes a U.S. Patriot anti-air battery, a weapon which officials previously said would be off the table for Ukraine. It remains unclear where the battery will be deployed or who will operate it, as the Pentagon said in March that Ukrainian troops would require lengthy training and direct U.S. assistance to use the system. And as far as I've seen, Will Porter is the first and I think only person, and this is in our article, but really all credit to Will on that, who has highlighted and really tried to report that the U.S. is going to send a Patriot battery, at least according, to the official statements that we have seen on that bill. Now, another system being discussed, being sent to Ukraine is long-range rockets, and me and Will wrote this on May 19th. Biden reverses course on plans to ship long-range rockets to Ukraine. President Joe Biden is resisting demands from Kiev to supply long-range rocket launchers to the Ukrainian military, Politico reported, suggesting the White House is concerned about the weapons could be used for strikes inside of Russia. Ukrainian officials have requested increasingly advanced military weaponry from Washington in recent months, even before Moscow's invasion commenced earlier this year, and are currently urging the United States to send M270 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, along with other hardware. While Biden was reportedly willing to consider sending these missiles to Ukraine last month, it is reported that he has cooled on that, and this from a source. There was momentum on it at Ramstein, that's the airbase in Germany that the Biden visited, but that seems to have cooled. And there's definitely frustration building among officials in Kiev over perceived reluctance to send heavier arms. And so, in a way, it does seem pretty ungrateful from the Ukrainians. They've received or will receive 50-something billion in arms and other aid from the United States already. And to say, that you're not sending the right weapons is awfully assertive for, somebody who's demanding defense from the U.S. and aid from the U.S. to say. However, maybe Zelensky is waking up to the U.S. scheme here that what we want to do is fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. And when you consider how that's working out in total for the Ukrainians, it's not that absurd that the Ukrainians are demanding these weapons. The problem is that the U.S. is sending them, and of course not working to bring about a solution to this conflict that can happen without so much military involvement in arming Ukraine. There are ways that the U.S. could negotiate with Russia here, ease the tensions, and allow diplomacy to progress. But as far as we could tell, the U.S. and its most close allies like the UK are actually preventing this. And so I have this Nets article here. U.S. and UK split with France and claim there is no exit ramp for Putin. And again, this at antiwar.com. The U.S. and UK are eyeing the complete defeat of Russia in Ukraine, breaking with other NATO members that prefer a negotiated settlement. An American official stated the war ends with the defeat of Russia, and a high-level British official said Russian President Vladimir Putin must lose. Speaking to an Italian outlet, UK Foreign Minister Liz Truss said that Russia must be defeated in Ukraine and that there is no exit ramps for Putin. Putin must lose in Ukraine, and we must see its sovereignty and territorial integrity restored, she said, working with all of Europe to help the Ukrainians prevail. The comments by Truss were in response to French President Emmanuel Macron suggesting the West could end the war by making compromises with Moscow. And this is Macron's statement. We will have to do this with Ukraine and Russia around the table. The end of the discussion and the negotiation will be set by Ukraine and Russia, but it will not be done in denial or exclusion of each other, nor in humiliation. Along with Paris, Germany and Italy are pushing for a diplomatic resolution. However, the White House appears to be in line with Downing Street. On Friday, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, called for the defeat of Russia. We want to see the strategic defeat for Russia. We want Russia to leave Ukraine. We want Russia to stop the violence, stop these indiscriminate, brutal attacks on civilians. Since the start of the invasion, Washington has committed to the militaristic path in Ukraine. While Secretary of State Antony Blinken has not spoken with his Russian counterpart in over 3 months, the U.S. has approved over $30 billion in weapons transfers to Kiev. And then, of course, we had the signing and passage of that bill. So I think overall, with all the aid in total, it's well over $50 billion now that the U.S. is planning to send to Ukraine. It's just an absurd amount of money, and again committed to that militaristic path. Now, Zelensky says that his country is open to talks, but there's a lot of nuance to this, and so I wanted to really break down this article on the show. Zelensky says war cannot end without negotiations, offers talks if POWs are unharmed. I wrote this for antiwar.com on May 22nd. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his country could only the war in his country could only end at the negotiating table, and signaled that talks with Russia could begin soon. However, an advisor to Zelensky said diplomacy was counterproductive for Kiev. During a Ukrainian television appearance on Saturday, Zelensky laid out a path to resolve the war by talking with Russia. There are things that can only be reached at the negotiating table, Zelensky said. The war will be bloody, there will be fighting, but it will only definitively end through diplomacy. Zelensky was vague about potential talks, but indicated they could occur at the highest level. Discussions between Ukraine and Russia will undoubtedly take place. Under what format, I don't know. With intermediaries, without them, in a broader group, at the presidential level. The leader said he conditioned the talks on good treatment of captured Ukrainian cities and POWs. And he made these statements as the fighters who were in the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol were surrendering or had just surrendered. Dialogue between Kiev and Moscow has been on hold for a month. The Kremlin blames Ukraine for the lack of diplomatic progress. Last week, Deputy Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Renuko claimed Kiev was not responding to Moscow's proposals and left the negotiation table. No negotiations are taking place. Ukraine has actually withdrawn from the negotiating process, the deputy foreign minister said. While Zelensky was offering a new round of diplomacy, an advisor and member of the negotiating team threw cold water on the idea. The presidential advisor argued making compromises with Russia would backfire. And then this from Zelensky's advisor. The war will not stop after any concessions. It will just be put on pause for some time. And while with renewed intensity, the Russians will build up their weapons and manpower, they will start a new offensive, even more bloody and large scale. Directly contradicting Zelensky, he said that talks would not begin until Russian forces completely withdrew from Ukraine. The Russian forces must leave the country, and after that, resumption of peace, the peace process will take place. So you have Zelensky saying all this is going to require is good treatment. His advisor is saying that Russia must leave. Now, what is Ukrainian territory and what, Kiev is saying is Ukrainian territory when they make that demand? Are they talking like pre-February or pre-March, say, advances in Russian advances in Ukraine? That would kind of make sense. If they're talking about Crimea and the Donbass, then they're not really offering anything that could. It's a non-starter. It's a poison pill. Then and then I finished up the article. Several NATO states have discouraged Ukraine from making an agreement with Russia. During his visit to Kiev, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson instructed Zelensky not to negotiate with Russia. Johnson urged against any negotiations with Russia on terms that gave credence to the Kremlin's false narrative for the invasion, but stressed that this was a decision for the Ukrainian government, according to Johnson's office. But there's also a statement that even if Zelensky was willing to make a agreement with Russia, the West wasn't ready to yet. Washington has also largely abandoned the diplomat path. And then here I mentioned again about the lack of meetings between the U.S. State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Next article I have here, very happy with and how it came out of. From myself, and I believe Will Porter ended up contributing to this article with me. Senator Cruz, General Mark Milley, and Zelensky say Ukraine is vital to national security. At the cost of supporting Ukraine's war efforts mount, public officials seek to sell Americans on increased military spending and rampant inflation amid rapid inflation and various shortages. Senator Ted Cruz, General Mark Milley, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are presenting Ukraine as the United States' vital security interest. In a statement justifying his vote to send $40 billion in aid to Ukraine, Cruz argued that Ukraine was essential to security of the United States and Taiwan. If Putin wins in Ukraine, it will confirm for Xi that he can confidently invade Taiwan. He added, the reasons we should support our Ukrainian allies is it would protect American national security, it keeps Americans safer, and it prevents our enemies from getting stronger. This, is exactly like the we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over there, of either the Bush era Republicans or the Trump era Democrats. As Zelensky pleads with the West for more weapons, he is now claiming his forces must defeat Russia within his country or Americans will die. If we don't hold the line, Russia will proceed attacking the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. The U.S. military will have to go to the Baltic states, according to the 5th article, and they will have to fight there and die there, Zelensky said. And he is, of course, referring to Article 5 of the NATO's treaty that says, attack on one member is attack on all, and that if, Russia gets done with Ukraine, then they're going to go to the Baltics. And once Russia attacks the Baltics, the U.S. will have to fight. He presents no evidence for any of this. There's no reason to believe him. It's just all hysteria. But I do think it's playing very well to the American audience, especially the way the mainstream media is presenting this war. During his West Point commencement speech, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs claimed future wars could be fought against great powers, Russia and China. In a further callback to the Cold War, America's top military officer asserted that if great powers' aggressions were left unchecked, they would continue. Yet again, in Ukraine, we are learning the lesson that aggression left unchecked only emboldens the aggressor. In the three statements resemble a variation in the Cold War era domino theory. The theory contended that if communism spread to a new country, it would bring about further expansion. However, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara admitted in 1995 that the domino theory did not pan out as predicted. I think we were wrong. I do not believe that Vietnam was important to the communists. I don't believe that its loss it didn't lead to communist control of Asia. And, they play this out in the Middle East too. Basically, if you don't, if you aren't constantly carrying out aggression everywhere in every part of the world, then that means you're weak, and then bad things are going to happen everywhere. And it just never pans out that way. Now, last article that I wrote that I have to talk about today is from the Libertarian Institute with Will Porter. Russia will no longer depend on West, deepen trade ties with China. And that was a statement by Sergey Lavrov. Here we go. Russia's foreign minister, Sergey Lavrov, said his country would pivot its economic relationship away from the West and towards China, suggesting Moscow could even rebuff an offer to reopen trade with the U.S. and its allies. Speaking with reporters in Moscow on Monday, the Russian diplomat said that while his country would consider rebuilding ties with Western states, it is inclined to stick with the more dependable partners going forward. If they, the West, want to offer something in terms of resuming relations, then we will seriously consider whether we will need it or not, Lavrov said, adding that Russia could rely on only ourselves and countries which have proved themselves to be reliable and do not dance to some other piper's music. If Western countries continue to change their minds about and propose some form of cooperation, then we can decide. If Moscow were to accept such an offer, Lavrov insists Russia would never again become reliant on Western goods, saying we must cease being dependent in any way on supplies of absolutely everything that comes from the West for ensuring the development of crucially important sectors for security and economy or our homeland security sphere. The foreign minister explained Russia could turn to Beijing for products it would no longer get from the West. Technology from China is in no way inferior to the West. A great deal here will ensure mutual benefits, Lavrov said, also suggesting Chinese investments could create development opportunities in Russia's Siberia region. While Lavrov is contemplating the possibility of Western sanctions relief, Washington and several of its allies have shown no interest in normalizing trade ties or de-escalating the war. Last month, the British Prime Minister told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that even if Kiev was willing to make a deal with Russia, the West was not explicitly urging against any attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict. All right, so those are all the articles that either myself or Dave DeCamp or Will Porter writing with me always put together. I do want to mention that I think just today the Ukrainian government issued a warrant for the arrest of Viktor Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine who was overthrown in 2 U.S. coups, and then the U.S. is considering deploying special operations forces to the newly reopened embassy in Kiev, and the U.S. The White House, approved a new $100 million transfer of arms to Ukraine. All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Just want to give you a brief programming breakdown. The next episode of the show will be released on Thursday. Connor Freeman, co-host, coming back on to talk about his great article that he put together today. Or that was out today, and that episode is going to be recorded a couple days ahead of time. I will be at the Libertarian Party convention in Reno, and so almost every episode of the show is released within a couple hours of it being recorded, just because I always like to get the news to y'all as soon as possible. However, I am going to have that one just held up a little bit to space out the episodes since I won't be able to record being in Reno. Now, I do want to say that while I'm there, I have a plan to hang out with some listeners of the show. A few people have hit me up and said, hey, we really like the show. We'd like to do some. So if you would like to join us, please send me a direct message, and I will try to find some time to get together with some listeners of the show and do some, networking, reaching out and everything like that. So really excited about, what we have coming up here on the show, what's coming up this week here in Reno. And then again, the upcoming episode with Connor Freeman. So make sure everybody subscribe to the show somewhere, and see y'all next time.